Hello friends, welcome to CEC live lectures. Dear friends, as you know that in our previous session we talked on theories of revolution in contemporary politics. Dear friends, today also we are continuing further and we would be talking on theories of revolution in comparative politics. Today we are going to talk on all those revolutions which took place in the modern times. So we would be talking about theories in pertaining to the revolution in the modern times only. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Adabat College, University of Delhi. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha has immense experience and he is contributing a lot in the area of academics. We believe that today you are going to grab a maximum through him. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and let's try to understand today's topic in detail, that is theories of revolution in comparative politics. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetkaji, and good afternoon. In fact, today is the second part of our three-part series on this topic, that is theories of revolution in comparative politics. Now, in fact, at the very outset, we should remember one thing, that unlike the historians who are more interested in the chronology of events, who are more interested in the exact sequence through which revolutions have been brought about in history, comparative politics and political science, they deal with the arguments, particularly the arguments tracing the causes and the effects of revolutions. So therefore, it is considered a theoretical exercise unlike what is done in history, where the French Revolution, American War of Independence, glorious revolutions. These revolutions are studied, but studied from different framework. They are studied from different prism. Whereas political science deals with these revolutions in terms of the larger theoretical issues, in terms of the larger argument for creation of a new order, for creation of a new system, both political, social, and economic. So therefore, that is one important concern of political science as a discipline. And comparative politics has basically promoted this exercise in last several decades. And therefore, in fact, in 20th century, particularly after Second World War, we find that important theoretical developments have taken place on this issue, where scholars have reflected on various revolutions in modern times, and they have tried to figure out, they have tried to find out the exact reasons and the causes behind that upheaval, the revolutionary upheaval in society. So that's why we find that such path-breaking work, which has become some of them have become monumental. For example, Barrington Moore's Jr. Social Origin of Dictatorship and Democracy, Crane Brinton's Anatomy of Revolution, Theodore Skocpol's State and Revolution, and before all these, Hannah Arendt's on revolution, Tedgar's Why Men Rebel, in fact, Chalmers Johnson's entire exercise in understanding revolution from a structuralist functionalist perspective. So these are some of the important contributions coming from political scientists, political psychologists, and political sociologists to understand this entire issue called revolution in history. So this is something we should remember at the very outset, that our exercise, the political science and its discipline, are essentially focusing on these issues, not exactly sequence and events in history. Another thing we should remember, in the first part of our discussion, we looked at this entire issue, that what is difference between revolution and rebellion. In fact, as I mentioned in my earlier lecture, with reference to Hannah Arendt, who said that rebellion is basically leads to liberation, whereas revolution leads to freedom. So there is a difference between liberation and freedom. And what she meant by freedom was a different type of freedom. Of course, there is no consensus, there is no unanimity on this definition of freedom. For example, within the Marxist tradition, of course, this has been interpreted and looked at differently. But one thing is very clear, that revolution is different from rebellion, and this is what we had discussed in the first part of our lecture, that rebellion, you don't have a blueprint for future, revolution you have. There is no necessarily no organization, there is no leadership, there is no ideology in rebellion. At times it is spontaneous, but on the other hand revolution seems to be more planned, it more organized, well led, and therefore in fact it is not only the challenge to authority, but also a programmatic challenge. That is, one can say that it's an entire agenda for social change, and therefore a change which is well thought of, well organized, a change which is well planned. So therefore revolution is different from rebellion. Of course it is also different from movements, it is also different from many other things which are basically normally discussed in literature in terms of analyzing the changes in political, social and economic order. Rebel, revolt, all these words keep coming off and on when we discuss changes in society, changes in history. But revolution of course has a specific meaning. Another thing which we also took into account before I further move further, it is it is in order that I recapitulate some of the issues which were part of our earlier discussion. We also discussed that how revolution is nothing so special about modern time. Earlier also in ancient times, thinkers and scholars dealt with this question of revolution. That's why I mentioned that in Greek period, in fact someone like Aristotle had a very elaborate discussion on this issue, that is revolution. Of course his entire perspective was different, in fact from a point of view of order, from the point of view of preserving stability, and therefore it was not only revolution which he discussed, but he also discussed the causes of revolution and the remedies of revolution, that how revolution could be prevented. So therefore in fact this is not something which is so special about modern period. Ancient times also you find that scholars reflected on this issue, that is how revolutions happen, how change in power equations takes place, how change in political and social and economic structure is effected in society. So all these things were there. But modern times of course has been different from the ancient and the medieval in many senses. For example, the birth of modernity was itself heralded through number of changes, and some of them were cataclysmic changes. In fact, for example, even if we don't discuss French Revolution, American War of Independence, and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the Puritan Revolution of 1649 in Britain, in England, even then the number of changes which happened, in fact the entire process of industrialization, modernization, the development of capitalism is itself characterized as industrial revolution. It was some sort of revolution, of course happening not with an abrupt break, but nonetheless the changes were qualitative in nature. One thing is also significant in context of revolution, that when not only quantitative but qualitative change accompanies this, then of course generally it is characterized as revolution. So industrial revolution definitely led to qualitative change in different spheres in life, and therefore industrial revolution, it was not simply called industrialization, but it was called industrial revolution. So that is something significant, that from 1600, from 17th century, you have number of cataclysmic changes, you have number of episodes in history, events in history which have been characterized as revolution. Now 1777, American War of Independence. Of course it was a war for independence from the colonial power of the colonies, of the subjects residing in colonies, but nonetheless the kind of changes it basically kind of changes which happened were revolutionary in nature, not only in terms of constitutionalism and constitutional government, the birth of this entire discourse called federalism, entire realization of the ideas and the values of liberalism, be it natural rights, be it number of things. So therefore that was definitely a revolutionary transformation, both in terms of ideas and in terms of social and political reality. But not only American War of Independence, even the French Revolution of 1789 was equally revolutionary. Rather, in fact, the impact and the effect of French Revolution was more massive than any other revolution in modern time. So much so that in fact, as I alluded in my last lecture, that French Revolution led to three important reactions in realm of ideas, and those reactions in course of time became political theories. In fact, they became theories in the sense that and ideologies in the sense that scholars who subscribe to that particular framework, they not only looked at French Revolution from that framework, but also developed a worldview largely through that prism. And therefore, the three reactions which I mentioned in my last lecture coming from French Revolution were conservative, liberal and Marxist. And three reactions were not simply reactions, but they in fact acquired the status of theory, political theory and political ideology: conservatism, liberalism and Marxism. And we will be looking at all three schools and their protagonists. For example, Edmund Burke, who is considered the protagonist of this conservative school of thought, and Thomas Paine, who is basically one of the pioneers of liberal ideas and liberalism, along with Marx and his friend Engels, who not only gave birth to this entire ideology called Marxism, but also talked about revolution in such a way that revolution at times is equated with Marxist, and Leninist and Marxist and ideas of Marx and Engels, and of course the subsequent followers like Lenin, Mao, Fanon, Che Guevara and many others, along with many ideologues like Gramsci, Marcuse and others. Of course, Marcuse is also known as a neo-left intellectual. So therefore, this is something important, that the reaction in terms of the French Revolution having these three different directional movements of ideas: conservative, liberal and the Marxist, and they are looking at this entire exercise through which this revolutionary change was brought about in France in different ways. Conservatives condemning it, liberals admiring it, advocating it, and the Marxists not only considering a very important development in history, but nonetheless they considered it a revolutionary, but it was a bourgeois revolution and not a socialist revolution, not the revolution brought about by proletariat, the working class, who in this entire theory, in this entire ideology, Marxism, is basically the main agent of history, the agent of transformation. So French Revolution was an important landmark for Marxism in terms of the growth of productive forces, when the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class was at the forefront of this struggle and brought about these changes and overturned this entire order which was earlier in existence, that is the feudal order. So therefore, these three reactions are important, and we will be touching upon all three shortly. But what I am trying to mention here as a establishing a linkage between our first part of our discussion and this today what we are going to do, that this revolution, this understanding of revolution, therefore in modern times has acquired a different significance, so much so that one historian, Eric Hobsbawm, he has basically written a book called Age of Revolution, where he basically discusses that all these revolutions, how they happened in history, and therefore it was age of revolution, from one after another, starting with Puritan 1649, glorious 1688, American 1777, French 1789. Then later, of course, continued in 20th century, 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and 1949 the Chinese Revolution. And even after that, we have had many revolutions. For example, at not that scale, but nonetheless a smaller scale, some of the Latin American countries witnessed revolution. Cuba, Nicaragua, and even in Middle East, we have had a revolution in mid-1970s, Iran, which was called a different type of revolution, a religious religion-based revolution. So therefore, this revolution, this idea has picked up in history in modern time, and therefore we have had so many such revolutionary changes and revolutionary events in history, and therefore a historian calling it age of revolution is that makes a lot of sense. Now coming to this issue, that these revolutions, all of them are important, and therefore I will see later that the recent times in 20th century, particularly after Second World War, 1950s, the two important writings which have come from the point of view of comparative politics and political science. In fact, one is Crane Brinton, Anatomy of Revolution, and another is Barrington Moore Jr. and also Thaddeus Cockpole, State and Revolution. And what they do, that they have studied almost all the revolutions, not in one book. Of course, they have focused on certain revolutions. For example, Cockpole has focused on France, Russia and China. In fact, Barrington Moore Jr. Perhaps is more ambitious in terms of the range and the issues which he has covered, and therefore he has studied 3 different routes to modernization, as he calls, and we will have a more detailed discussion about Barrington Moore, not in the second but the third part of our discussion. Now, Barrington Moore Jr. Studies 3 different routes to modernization. That modernization for him is revolution, and one is of course Britain, United States of America and France. The second is of course that is the capitalism from below. That how the transformation started and got initiated from the bottom. The second is capitalism from the top, and that is the second route, that is Germany and Japan. And the third is of course a different type of modernization, that was a socialist revolution, Russia and China. And interestingly, Barrington Moore also discusses Indian case, which does not fit into all these 3 routes, and therefore his writing is of special significance from the point of view of India. So this is another. The third is Crane Brinton. Like Cockpole and Barrington Moore Jr., Crane Brinton has also basically based his entire study on some of these revolutions. So this is how we find that these revolutions are important, basis on basis of which theoretical exercises have been done in comparative politics. And I have just given 2-3 examples. Even Hannah Arendt, on revolution, what is basically the subject matter? In fact, she makes a comparison between French and the American, and how of course she has more laudatory word for American War of Independence, because for her any attempt in history, all attempts in history where social issues have been sought to be tackled through political means, they have invariably resulted into terror and authoritarianism and dictatorship. And therefore, for Hannah Arendt, social issues need not to be tackled through political means. And this is what she feels that French Revolution ultimately did. And therefore, she is more comfortable with the American War of Independence, where political means were not used for settling or basically dealing with the social question, and therefore that resulted into freedom. So what I am trying to say, that all these scholars have dealt with this question of revolution one after another. Of course, that one can say that this is the subject matter on basis of which they have built their theories. Theories they have not built just in air. They have basically based their arguments on concrete historical facts, drawing on these revolutionary changes and revolutionary events in history. Now, with this background, we have to see that how this French Revolution, of course, even American War of Independence is equally important in terms of many political values which it institutionalized, many political values which it concretized, many political frameworks which were given birth by this entire exercise that is called American War of Independence. And 2 or 3 of them are very important from the point of view of political science. This entire discourse of federalism, this entire discourse of rights, the entire discourse of separation of power, in fact this entire exercise of judicial review, all these things which have become important part of this constitutional discourse or legal constitutional discourse, or one can say constitutionalism, modern constitutionalism. They have been the gift of American War of Independence. So no one can ignore or undermine or ignore this entire contribution of American War of Independence and the Philadelphia Convention, through which this first written liberal democratic constitution was created in 1787 in United States of America. So that is there. But the French Revolution, because it was the first of its sort, and therefore when liberty, equality, fraternity, the 3 values which were basically used as the basis for this entire revolution. And therefore, it had a more far-reaching impacts in terms of the evolution of ideas, in terms of the reactions, in terms of responses, and therefore French Revolution becomes very significant. Now, out of three reflections or three reactions or three responses which I mentioned, the conservative, liberal and Marxist. Before I move to this Marxist, which perhaps requires a more detailed discussion, as I mentioned, the revolution becomes synonymous with Marxism, and therefore there is requirement or there is a need for a more detailed, thorough discussion of the Marxist perspective on revolution. But before I do that, now what is this conservative and liberal discourse of revolution? That is important. Now, one thing is very clear, that Burke, Paine, Tocqueville, these are the three important thinkers in modern times who have dealt with this issue in their own way. As I mentioned, that the Burke and the Tocqueville, they were against French Revolution, but nonetheless Burke is remembered as a conservative thinker, but Tocqueville is not. Similarly, Paine, in fact, he admired French Revolution, and therefore he is also remembered as, not because of his admiration for French Revolution, but Paine is remembered as one of the architects of liberal ideas and liberalism. So much so that many people believe that Thomas Paine was basically the inspiration behind the French Revolution, of course, along with Rousseau and Voltaire. So therefore, this is something important. So these two reactions. First of all, let us start with the conservative reaction. That is Burke and his important writing, his important book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in 1790. In fact, this book is quite significant. It is from the conservative point of view, because for him, the two principles which Burke uses in analyzing revolution, one is conservation, another is correction. And therefore, he tries to test all revolution on this touchstone, whether they have been adhered to or not, whether conservation and correction have been properly adhered to or not by any revolutionary act. And therefore, when he makes a comparison between the French and the American, the French and the English Revolution, Burke finds that in England, these two principles, were not only adhered, but they were in fact, they were simply, considered so sacrosanct that no deviation took place from these two things. And therefore, in fact, these two principles, that is conservation and correction, according to Burke, they allow a rectification of deficiencies within the existing framework, unlike other revolution, that is the France, where there was a complete break from the past. So what happened in France, according to Burke, was a total wholesale attack on the established religion, traditional constitutional arrangements, and the institution of property. The three hallmarks, or the true bastion, or one can say the mainstay of traditional order. And therefore, since there was a wholesale attack on all these three things, that is established religion, traditional constitutional arrangement, and institution of property, it heralded a complete break from the past, and therefore the balance between the old and new was totally disturbed. And therefore, according to Burke, in fact, this revolution played havoc with human life and human history. In fact, Burke supported American Revolution because in his opinion, it did not redress the grievances by invoking natural rights. Of course, he was a great admirer of the Glorious Revolution. He was a great admirer of the English way of thinking. It is a different matter. The Burke, of course, is someone who also supported Irish cause. He supported particularly the impeachment of Warren Hastings, the Governor General of India. On a number of issues, his ideas, of course, are different from what we find in these reflections. But nonetheless, for Burke, equality and nationalism, the twin values which were invoked by French Revolution, and they were basically the responsible for playing this havoc, wreaking this havoc. Because what happens that both equality and nationalism, according to Burke, are the regions, are the means of tyranny. because they can erode social and moral conditions of liberty, and therefore they can lead to tyranny. So therefore, in his opinion, in Burke's opinion, the French Revolution essentially tried to highlight and promote these two values, equality and nationalism. We have seen that subsequently, in later part of particularly in 20th century, even Hannah Arendt, when made a comparison between French and the American revolutions, she also thought that in French Revolution the equality discourse dominated and the social and economic issues were sought to be dealt with political means, and therefore that led to tyranny. Because one thing is very important, French Revolution was basically brought about for liberty, equality and fraternity, but the after effect we see in terms of rise of a Bonapartist rule, the Napoleon Bonaparte, the great dictator, and therefore what happens, that French Revolution, the reason for which this revolution was brought about, was totally defeated by the subsequent events. But nonetheless, no one can run away from this fact that so far liberty, equality and fraternity as values are concerned, French Revolution has played important role in modern history. So therefore, Burke's reaction is based on this premise, that how equality and nationalism were prioritized, privileged, and therefore basically they eroded social and moral conditions of liberty and paved the way for tyranny. In fact, this is how the Burkean reaction takes place. Another reaction, which was liberal in nature, came from Paine, and that is also important, that how Thomas Paine looked at this entire exercise. So therefore, in fact, these issues have to be seen before we move to the Marxian reaction or the Marxist understanding of revolution, and how the Marxist reaction and response came so far as the French Revolution is concerned.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session where we are discussing on theories of revolution in comparative politics. Dear friends, we have discussed on the theories by the various theorists, and we would be continuing further and would be discussing more after this short break. So be with us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Dear friends, as you know that today we are talking on theories of revolution in comparative politics. We have discussed on the various theories in our previous session. So taking this session forward, in this session we are basically going to talk on Paine, Tocqueville, Marx and Marxism. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, who is giving us in-depth knowledge on today's topics. So let's welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, and let's continue our lecture further. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you. In fact, in the last session, we were discussing about Burke, that is the conservative reaction so far as the French Revolution is concerned, and his admiration for the English Revolution, to some extent also the American Revolution. But now after looking at this conservative response, let's have a look at this liberal response to this French Revolution, which is best channelized and best captured by Thomas Paine and his ideas and his writing. In fact, Thomas Paine not only defended French Revolution, but in fact he is considered as one of the pioneers, or one of the product, or one of the the votary of Enlightenment ideas and Enlightenment liberalism. So therefore, in fact, Paine, who is also believed to have supported representative government with all its attributes, rule of law, constitutionalism, rights, and so on and so forth, and and most importantly, defender of natural rights, which was so which was condemned, or which was an anathema for Burke. In fact, was important value for Paine, that is natural right, the discourse on natural rights, which is of course one of the important premises of liberalism, since John Locke's ideas became popular and prominent. Now, of course, Paine rejects Burke's idealization of hereditary system, because in fact Paine believes that what Burke was doing that was, he was simply trying to glorify the British traditional way of life. He was simply glorifying the British values, and he was not alive to the new reality. He was not alive to new rationalism. He was not alive to Enlightenment discourse and Enlightenment values. So therefore, Paine reaction to French Revolution was highly laudatory, and therefore I told you, I mentioned earlier that in fact he is considered as one of the inspiration behind French Revolution. One can say that one of the great theoretician or ideologue of French Revolution, like Rousseau and Voltaire. So therefore there is a difference in reaction from Paine, from Edmund Burke, so far as the French Revolution is concerned. Now the third reaction of the French Revolution comes from someone who cannot be strictly straight-jacketed, or one cannot be fitted into this conservative liberal mold. But nonetheless, one can say that he was essentially a liberal thinker. Alex Tocqueville, a French, many people believe that he was a French and he was a tormented soul, particularly due to the French experience. French aristocrat. His background, the social background, was from aristocracy. So therefore, Tocqueville, who subsequently wrote that famous treatise on American democracy, the 3 volumes, in which he basically spoke so high of associational life, United States of America. The same Tocqueville, who was also alarmed at this entire growth of this idea of equality, as a passion, particularly equality before law, and he was also of the view that the French Revolution unleashed all these passions, particularly passion for equality, and it was going to destroy all class privileges, and it also destroy all hindrances to the authority of a state, and therefore in fact it will be a threat to liberty of individuals and ultimately a threat to democracy. So this is how he basically comes to this question when he compares the French and the American experiences, when he compares the French and American revolutions. And therefore Tocqueville, particularly in this book that is called Old Regime and the French Revolution, which he wrote in 1856, in fact he makes a very interesting observation. Tocqueville says that revolution seldom occurs as a result of absolute poverty and gross deprivation. Rather, revolution occurs when government relaxes its grip after long spell of operation. So therefore what happens that it has nothing to do with deprivation, it has nothing to do with poverty, it is largely the weakness of the authority, it is a weakness of the state. When it loosens control on the people, then you find that revolution happens. So in fact the 2 events which had tremendous impact and influence on Tocqueville's ideas were 1789, that is the French Revolution, and 1848, that was series of revolutionary upheavals in Europe, which also completely transformed Marx, particularly after he wrote Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, when he started thinking about a different theory of revolution, which is known as subsidiary theory of revolution in Marxism, which we will be discussing shortly. So what happened that in Tocqueville, these two events, 1789, the French Revolution, and 1848, that is many revolutionary upheavals, but not revolution per se, in Europe as a whole, it had a great impact on Tocqueville's ideas and Tocqueville's writings. Now what happened that Tocqueville tries to figure out the causes of revolution, particularly in this book Old Regime and French Revolution, which was published in 1856. And when discussing these causes of revolution, there are 4 or 5 important arguments which he develops. The first is that the revolution cannot be regarded as a conspiracy. Because normally, around that time there was a conspiratorial theory of revolution, that it is a conspiracy of a class or a group of people or intelligentsia or security people. But Tocqueville revises this argument and said that it cannot be considered as a conspiracy. Number 2, the second argument he develops, that no revolution can occur without an ideology, and therefore for him this ideological preparation in revolution is always important. For him, the ideas cause history or cause change and revolution, and this is something very significant, because this is where perhaps Marxism is basically parting company with all these studies, all these observations and all these reflections on revolution, because for Marx it is ultimately the material conditions, the material factors, it is basically the contradictions, the economic factor, which acts as a motor force of history, the driving force of history. And therefore, all revolutions are basically the result of these contradictions, that is the economic and material contradictions. But for Tocqueville, it is ideas which cause revolution. And therefore, what happens that according to him, that those who propagate those ideas generally, or it is also possible that they may not be aware the kind of impact it will have, but nonetheless their ideas play important role, and therefore for him every revolution can be seen in terms of certain ideas which were propagated, championed around that time. The third argument which he develops is that a time comes during that revolutionary or preceding that revolutionary upheaval, when the status quoist and the conservative sections of the society, they develop a self-doubt. Particularly, the ruling class develop that self-doubt, and they lose this will to rule. And this is something very significant, because he argues that when this happens, when this self-doubt creeps in, when the will to rule gets eroded, then perhaps the chances of revolution become very bright and quite possible. The fourth cause which he tries to highlight is that when a reform precedes such a revolutionary upheaval, because his understanding is that always revolutions happen after reform, and because of reform what happens that certain changes happen in the life of the subordinate classes, and therefore they start aspiring for something better. So therefore it is not the absolute misery, but nonetheless what happens that this relative sense of miseries, relative deprivation, that becomes the driving force. And this is something quite significant, because we will see that in 20th century, from the psychological perspective, Tedgar in his book Why Men Rebel basically promoted and championed this argument that it is always not the absolute sense of deprivation, but relative deprivation which is the cause of revolution. And the last factor, according to Tocqueville, is that when all subordinate classes start feeling sense of just grievances, that whatever grievances they have, they are just, then of course the condition for revolution is built and prepared. So therefore, on basis of his understanding or a study of these two revolutions, the French and American, Tocqueville comes out with these 5 different set of arguments that how the causes of revolution could be seen through this framework. But nonetheless, one thing is very important, that as a liberal thinker, Tocqueville, who wrote that celebrated book on democracy on America, that is Democracy in America, where he spoke high of the American experiment, where he talked about that associational life, the entire civil society, organizations and institutions in the United States of America, which paved the way both for democracy and freedom, and the kind of alarmist bell which he rang so far as this passion for equality is concerned, because he thought that this passion for equality will one day simply swallow and destroy liberty. In fact, for him this French Revolution was basically the main reason or the main basis, or one can say the culprit for unleashing this passion for equality. So this is how we have seen this reaction coming from Tocqueville so far the French Revolution is concerned. Now coming to the third reaction. In fact, conservative and liberal we have already seen. Conservative coming from Burke, liberal coming from Penn and Tocqueville. Of course, different sets of argument, different types of argument. And the third reaction or response is known as Marxism of the French Revolution. Because one thing is very clear, that Marx, in fact, who considered revolution as a midwife of history, that without revolution nothing can happen in terms of human values, like liberty, equality, and all these values. But nonetheless, the context of that, those values is also important, because he believed, Karl Marx, he always believed that the French Revolution was a bourgeois revolution. It was brought about by the capitalist class, and the purpose was essentially to make a break from the earlier feudal arrangement and move towards capitalism. So therefore, French Revolution was basically the high point of bourgeois revolution for Marx. But not only French, but the English Revolution was also a bourgeois revolution. But what Marx thought, that in England, this bourgeois revolution was completed in economic sphere, and in France it was completed in political sphere. So in two different spheres this revolution got completed. But nonetheless, in none of these countries, in both spheres, this entire bourgeois revolution was complete. This is one thing is very important to remember. Another thing, that for Marx, revolution is equivalent to something apocalyptic change, and the French Revolution symbolized that. That how this apocalyptic change happened in France, because revolution for Marx is not only the change in political order. Revolution for Marx is not change of political gods, but revolution after all for Marx is the change and transformation of social and economic structure. That is the mode of production, and mode of production for Marx basically implies a combination of relations of production and the forces of production, which is perhaps the basic structure of society. And therefore, for Marx, when the change occurs in the basic structure, then only one can say that the change is a revolutionary change. Any change in superstructural level, that is state, law, politics, would have no impact on the social and economic structure. So this is how this important argument comes in Marxian theory of revolution, and therefore it is different from all other theories which we have discussed. And it is from this point of view that we have to see that Marx neither fully endorsed French Revolution or American revolution, nor thought of the American war of independence as something which got freedom to people, or which basically made this entire discourse of freedom, democracy, and equality meaningful, or material from idea it got materialized. Nothing of this sort. In fact, unlike the Burke, Penn, Tocqueville, and many other thinkers, what we find that Marx considered all three of them as bourgeois revolution, and therefore, in fact, only a step in direction of a more egalitarian social order, that would be socialism. And therefore, in his entire understanding of history, which is based on his historical materialism and class struggle. In fact, of course, it is not possible right now to go into this entire argument which he promotes for historical materialism and class struggle, along with this entire idea of mode of development of mode of production and the theory of contradiction through which history moves, because for him history does not move through ideas, but history moves through this material forces, because material forces are driving force of history through contradiction, because at in every age and every epoch this contradiction happens between the two, the relations and the the means, relations and the forces, and this contradiction between relations of production and forces of production ultimately gets settled, and this is how revolutions happen. Therefore, this entire historical sketch which he provides, from primitive communism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism and socialism, because socialism again a transitional stage in direction of communism, is basically the larger scale on which he tries to look at the history, look at the revolution in human history. And therefore, French Revolution was a very important event for Marx, and therefore even if it was a bourgeois revolution, nonetheless it was paving the way for movement of modern society in direction of the larger goal or larger value, that is egalitarianism of socialist sort. So therefore, this is how we find that Marx looks at this entire issue of revolution and and the question of French Revolution and the English Revolution. But one thing is important, that for Marx, so far revolution is concerned, there are two different set of theories. One is called the primary theory, another is called subsidiary theory. And interestingly, later on we find that the subsidiary theory became the primary theory in Marx. And therefore, many scholars argue that history played a trick with Karl Marx, because he never thought that his ideas would be practiced and the revolution would be brought about in a backward country like Russia, and not a developed country like England or some other European country. So therefore, he always visualized a revolution in a more advanced capitalist country, because what would happen, that the material conditions would already be there for arrival of socialism, because socialism comes when capitalism prepares the ground, when the production process reaches a certain stage, when material abundance is created in society, then perhaps the proletariat comes forward and basically overthrows this capitalist regime, the regime of the bourgeoisie, and brings about new change, that is socialism. And that socialism or basically as a transitional stage, but only moving in direction of higher stage of capitalism, communism, where the principle of justice would be each according to his ability, each according to need, whereas in socialism the principle of distribution would be each according to his ability and each according to his or her work. So therefore, this was the larger vision of history which Marx provided, or based on this historical materialism and his method of dialectics, and therefore he parted company with all his contemporaries and predecessors so far as history and the driving force of history and the change in history is concerned. But interestingly, what happened, that 1848 when you had an abortive revolution in Europe, and therefore what we find that this revolution which happened, which was going to happen, or at least Marx was quite optimistic that this revolution would happen in Europe, got aborted. And therefore what happened, that he came out with a pamphlet or a writing called Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany in 1848. And therefore the one important significant observation he makes here, he says that the bourgeoisie will not make even a bourgeois revolution now, because bourgeoisie has become conservative, and therefore the proletariat has to be ready even to go for this bourgeois revolution, because the proletariat will have to bring the bourgeois revolution also along with this proletarian revolution. So this is something he observed in context of this abortive revolution of 1848, and this is what is known as his subsidiary theory of revolution, which was later on in fact was popularized or was practiced by Lenin in Russia in 1917. As I mentioned earlier that Russia was not a very advanced capitalist country. There were many more advanced capitalist countries of Europe where the revolutions didn't take place, but revolution ultimately happened in Russia, which Marx didn't practice, but Marx visualized, but Lenin practiced. Now what happens that this is one issue, that is the subsidiary and the primary. The primary revolution is that history moves through these material contradictions, reaches a stage of development when therefore this bourgeois revolution takes place, when the material conditions are ripe, then perhaps the contradictions happens between the forces and relations and the proletarian revolution takes place and socialism comes into existence. But this subsidiary theory, which was basically offered in context of 1848 abortive revolution in Europe by Karl Marx, became the primary theory subsequently, because two important revolutions which were brought about in history based on Marx's ideas. One is the Russian Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, another is Chinese Revolution of 1949. Both were based on this subsidiary theory, not the primary theory, because here both countries were not considered developed capitalist countries, and in both countries attempt was made to bring about the bourgeois revolution by the working class. So in fact the working class tried to push even the bourgeois revolution ahead. So therefore this is something important. The second important thing is this peasants and workers role in history, which have been studied by a number of scholars, and we will see later that how Barrington Moore Jr. in 20th century has provided a very interesting account of the role of lords and peasants in making of revolutions, particularly in United States of America, France, England, Russia, China, Germany and Japan, along with India. But what Marx, this was also an issue for Marx, because Marx never considered peasants or peasantry as agent of history or agent of change. It always thought that the proletariat would be the subject of revolution. It will be the agent of revolutionary change, because the peasants by nature was considered conservative, sacks of potato. I mean, there was no communication among them. There were a lot of conservative ideas among them. Therefore, they could never become revolutionary. But proletariat, on the other hand, in the new capitalist settings, in urban settings, in industrial settings, they were given this historic role, the subjecthood within the Marxian theory of revolution. Now, one thing is important here. The subsequent changes which happened in the Marxian ideas on revolution on account of this new understanding about the role of peasants. And it is here that one thing is should be remembered, that the revolution, after the failure of revolution in France, Marx made a very perceptive observation that France has defeated Paris, and France symbolizes here stands for peasantry, and the Paris stands for industrial working class or the proletariat. So he started thinking of this new alliance between the peasantry and the working class as basically the driving force of revolution. Because earlier he thought that only the proletariat would be the agent of change, and it will be historical agent of it will be the agent of history. Now Engels, in his very famous book, Engels, who was a collaborator of Marx, a great friend, most of his writings bear the stamp of both Marx and Engels. He wrote a book, Peasant War in Germany 1850. There also Engels talked about the alliance between that how peasantry has ditched the cause of the industrial working class. And in this peasant war in Germany, Engels pointed out the way the alliance between the burghers and the aristocracy in in earlier era was responsible for counter-revolution. Similarly, the new alliance between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy was responsible for this abortive revolution of 1858. Earlier it was alliance between the noble and the burghers, and 1848 he considered an alliance between the bourgeoisie and aristocracy as the responsible for this abortive revolution. And therefore, in fact, what we find that this new thinking started about this entire strategy of revolution after 1848, so far as the Marx and Engels is concerned. But this entire argument for subsidiary theory of revolution, as I have mentioned, that it can happen even in non-industrialized country like Russia, or it can be attempted even in those countries where material conditions are not ripe for revolutionary change as per the earlier Marxist doctrine. And number two, that this new role for the peasantry which was assigned. And in 20th century, the two revolutions which took place based on this idea, that is Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution and Chinese Revolution, basically practiced both these theories. One, that it was brought about in a non-capitalist country, and number two, the role of peasants was also recognized. Now, one thing is important, that number of ideas later on came up within the Marxist theory on question of revolution. And it is here that we find that number of strands also developed, be it Eurocommunism, be it revisionism, be it democratic socialism. All these things emerged as a result of this debate within Marxism. Because as per the Marxian prophecy, revolution could have come or would have come or should have come in Europe at that time, but it was not coming. Why it was not coming? And therefore, on the one hand, Marx was holding responsible this news, the failure of peasants and workers' alliance, or the bourgeoisie, the failure of the bourgeois class to bring about bourgeois revolution. On the other hand, a revisionist thinking started that should we move away from this Marxian doctrine of revolution, revolution as a apocalyptic change, and how we can think of gradual evolution of socialism and gradual evolution of freedom and justice. And it is here the Bernstein and his entire revisionist Marxism becomes important. In fact, gradually, of course, there was tremendous impact on Bernstein of Fabian ideas, because Fabianism itself believes in gradualism, gradual evolution of freedom and equality and democracy. But Bernstein is credited for taking it to the new height, this entire revisionist perspective, because he gave 5 different arguments that why Marxian revolution was not happening. He said that Marx's prophecy for rate of profit to fall is not falling, wages are not going down, middle class has not disappeared, and no sign of collapse of capitalism, and working class is getting embourgeoised, embourgeoisement of working class. And therefore, he said that now we have to think about a new route to revolution. This is how this gradualism starts. But number of other developments have taken place within Marxism, that is role of Gramsci and many other thinkers, along with the 20th century theories like Crane Brinton, Barrington Moore, Theda Skocpol and others, which we will discuss in the next part of our discussion.
With this one, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session. Friends, we will be meeting again very soon and would be conducting another lecture on the topic, that is the theories of revolution in comparative politics. Friends, you are requested to write to us if you have any queries regarding today's lecture. And yes, of course, you can give your feedback to at info.cec@nic.in. With this note, we are taking your leave with the promise that we will be meeting again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.